Introduce to you Dr. Arthur Drayton from the University of the West Indies. He did his undergraduate and graduate work at the University of London and has taught in Trinidad, Antigua, England, Nigeria, Jamaica, and has served as visiting professor in West Indian literature at Boston University and is currently distinguished foreign scholar under the Massawa program at the University of Kansas at Lawrence, Kansas. Massawa is the Midwest State Universities Association, Mid-American State Universities Association, and the Graduate College, therefore, is sponsoring his talk tonight, along with the Foreign Language Department, the English Department, and the Lecture Committee. And we're just most happy to have him here, and it's been quite an effort to get here with the snow and planes and everything, and we're just very grateful to have him. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Drayton.
How does it? Is there a guarantee for my coat? My subject is this. This is part of the. This is in the business room. So you want me over here, right? My subject this evening is humane hatred, from anguish to art in the black literature of protest. The recent contretemps in Oklahoma over the request of a schoolgirl to recite Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream indirectly encourages the question of how complete is the acceptance of black protest literature as literature to which everybody ought to be exposed. I am a little disturbed by the implication of one reason I heard for disallowing the recitation, that the speech has racial elements in it. For it is precisely racism that the speech is about, in a way. And more importantly, it is racism in American society that made the speech necessary. And yet, it is a speech that rises above racism and testifies to man's unconquerable will. If, to come to the subject of literature, we are to exclude work which is an expression of the experience of white racism, are we not at the same time shutting out the finest example of the resilience of the human spirit over the past 400 years? It may be that the conscious motivation of the officials in this particular issue was no less sincere than in the case of countless others who feel that aggressive black literature does not have a place in the corpus of civilized literature for normal consumption. But there are some at the conscious level, and ever so many more at a subconscious level, who are aptly described by a comment made by C.L.R. James, the West Indian writer, in his book published in 1961, Beyond a Boundary. James wrote, "There are people who, having enjoyed the profits and privileges of racialism for most of a lifetime, now that racialism is under fire and in retreat, profess a lofty scorn for it, and are terribly pained when you so much as refer to it in any shape or form. Their means have changed, not their ends, which are the same as they always were, to exploit racialism for their own comfort and convenience." There are indeed people such as James describes, but it would be unfair and less than true not to acknowledge another aspect. That is, there are those who refuse to face other people's anguish, particularly where they as a people have been responsible for that anguish. I'm reminded here of a Newsweek essay on education published on November the 7th, 1977, and entitled Teachers and Race. Albert Shanker, president of the American Federation of Teachers, is credited in that article with objecting to the assignment of teachers by race-related criteria in the following words: "We are on the verge of becoming more racially conscious, aware, and divided." I submit that blacks are incapable of becoming more racially conscious and aware, so that Shanker's "we" must mean whites, in which case I confess to a certain horror that surges within me at the intimation that the response of whites to the presence of blacks on more equal terms is likely, in his view, to be increased racial consciousness and awareness of a kind that would lead to further racial disharmony. That, in my view, only strengthens the case for a more intense integration of black protest literature in the educational curricula at all levels. The complete function of literature, as much in our leisured moments as in the classroom, goes far beyond the cozy habit of the aesthetic exercise. Literature is nothing if it does not serve to lead us to the contemplation of human behavior as it affects the total society in which man must live, and the morality which furthers or hinders man's quest for happiness and fulfillment. Given that rationale, it seems inconceivable that we should be tolerant of the underemphasis of a substantial area of American, indeed world history and experience by excluding or glossing over the aggressive areas of black literature. It is my basic contention that all of us, blacks and whites, Americans, Africans, Europeans, and the rest of the world, have everything to gain and nothing to lose from a square confrontation of what it is to be oppressed and to be oppressor. For until, as human beings, we are prepared to face those awkward truths about ourselves, and to ensure that every rising generation is aware of these possibilities in themselves, until then, the continuation of oppression and its resurgence from time to time will continue to plague us. The unease in the presence of this literature, and by extension the experience that lies behind it, is not limited to whites, nor for that matter to Americans. At the very time of the rise of aggressive black literature in the US, the authors themselves raised the question as to whether they were writing art or literature. Writers like Claude McKay, W.B. Du Bois, Alain Locke wrestled with the question. Fortunately, they were to recognize in the words of Du Bois that all art is propaganda and ever must be. And not too long ago, middle-class West Indians resented much of their own literature because, as they complained, it contained violence and the ugliness of life. Why do they have to write about these things? Langston Hughes encountered the same attitude, especially after the publication in 1927 of Fine Clothes to the Jew, for which he earned from one critic the label Poet Laureate of Harlem. Another critic was to cry out, "It does not matter to me whether every poem in the book is true to life. Why should it be paraded before the American public by a Negro author as being typical or representative of the Negro?" If blacks are in the main now beyond that stage, others still recoil from what they choose to see as an expression of hatred and racism. Sorry? Let us look a little closer at the reality of that literature of hate. Claude McKay was the one poet of the Harlem Renaissance whom many characterized as a poet of hate. But listen carefully to Claude McKay. "Although she feeds me bread of bitterness and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth, stealing my breath of life, I will confess I love this cultured hell that tests my youth. This ambivalent reaction to racist America is to be found more than once in what is his most virulent poems. For example, the poems The White House and The White City. This complexity of response, that is itself anguish, is to be found in black protest literature everywhere. Dennis Brutus in South Africa, writing in a situation that is not entirely unlike what North America was, that is perhaps the outcome of what America was at that time. Dennis Brutus can nonetheless say, "No, I do not brim with sorrow. Anger does not effervesce in viscerally rancid belches or burst its bubbles on my optic nerves. Gall is not secret in my parotids, nor hatred fetid on my breath." Aimé Césaire, one of the founding fathers of negritude, envisages the destruction of those aspects of white civilization that turns it into oppressor. "Make me rebellious against all vanity, but docile to its genius. Make of me its executioner. The time has come to gird my loins like a man of courage. But at the execution, let my heart preserve me from all hate. Do not make of me that man of hate for whom I have only hate. I was born of this unique race, yet knowing my tyrannical love, you know, it is not by hatred of other races that I prosecute for mine. All that I would wish is to answer the universal hunger, the universal thirst." Césaire's West Indian colleague, Guy Tyrolien, at the end of a poem in which he is protesting against being stereotyped and simplified by the white image of him, can proclaim, "Yes, I shall glorify man, every man. I shall go to them all with a heart filled with song and hands heavy with friendship, for they are made in my image." And in East Africa, Okot Pibitek has produced in Song of Lawino the latest stage, perhaps, of negritude, where it is no longer necessary to address the white world or to inveigh against it. The audience is now fellow blacks, and the anguish is different when Lawino appeals to her husband, Ochol. "I do not understand the ways of foreigners, but I do not despise their customs. Why should you despise yours? Listen, my husband, you are the son of a chief. The pumpkin in the old homestead must not be uprooted." As long as these writers are part of a society in which their people are oppressed or in any way victimized because they're black, or for that matter, as long as blacks suffer oppression, victimization, and prejudice as a people anywhere in the world, these writers cannot be immune to the hatred which a hateful system sooner or later engenders in the breast of all blacks. But the writer, as I.A. Richards has observed, is the point at which the growth of the mind shows itself. A writer who becomes imprisoned in anger and hatred is not going to be worth very much to us after all. For we value very highly in literature its capacity to lead us into contact with the infinite varieties of the human condition. And to exercise this gift, a writer needs the whole range of his human feelings. Anger and hatred may provide the creative impulse, but to surrender entirely to them is to run the risk of atrophy. And so the black writer transmutes his hatred into a humane hatred, a hatred that paradoxically rests upon love. He keeps steady before him and cherishes all the beauty that is possible in the human condition, and his hatred is directed to that which threatens it. It is a hatred that seeks, on the one hand, to liberate the oppressor from the corrosive effects of being oppressor, and on the other hand, to preserve the humaneness of the oppressed. It is this twofold objective that accounts for the coexistence within these works of aggression and what has so often been dismissed as romanticizing, but what is really the countervailing strategy of the assertion of human possibilities. To achieve this, the writer must strive, in spite of all provocation, to remain human and to put cruelty into a human perspective, to perceive that the moral deformity of oppression is, in a sense, more damaging to the oppressor than the oppressed, but ultimately destructive of everyone. Yet, it is hatred and anguish that impart that energy to protest literature and distinguishes it from the literature of social criticism. For we cannot use the term literature of protest to include the normal protestations of social criticism, in the sense in which, say, Hard Times or Middlemarch make powerful protestations. At the same time, the literature of protest is not the only kind of literature to be generated from a given set of experience. The response to the Black experience, for example, has differed in time and from country to country and from writer to writer. Affirmation of identity, for instance, is one kind of protestation emerging from the Black experience. It belongs to the period or moments when the writer is appealing to human decency in the oppressor or buoying up the dignity of his people, when, in the words of the West Indian poet Edward Brathwaite, hope in my belly, hate smothered down to the bone to suit the part I am playing. It is in this category I would put Langston Hughes's The Negro Speaks of Rivers. But sometimes that hate is and cannot be smothered. Sometimes that hate is not and cannot be smothered deep enough, and therefore it erupts in the imagery or in the tension of the poem or the novel, as the case may be. We saw it in the executioner image of Césaire. And throughout Césaire's classic work, Cahiers, there is violent imagery. The poem, in fact, owes its appeal partly to the tension created by the coexistence of the violent and the gentle, of hatred and love. In Denis Brutus, there is an anger which he refuses to allow to cripple him, but it is anger nonetheless. And in Léon Damas, you feel the smothered rage all the time. If we take a poem like Langston Hughes's Dream Variation, we find that on the surface, it is an affirmation of identity. But beneath the surface, the poem becomes a muted expression of hatred for the white world. The atavistic yearning for freedom expressed in the first stanza becomes an act of defiance by the second stanza, becomes even a challenge to combat in which the destruction of the white world is anticipated. I want to read that poem very quickly. I'm moving a little difficulty. I feel I'm going to be strangled at any time. Dream Variation by Langston Hughes. To fling my arms wide in some place of the sun, to whirl and to dance till the white day is done, then rest at cool evening beneath a tall tree, while night comes on gently, dark like me. That is my dream. To fling my arms wide in the face of the sun, dance, whirl, whirl, till the quick day is done, rest at pale evening, a tall, slim tree, night coming tenderly, black like me. As we look at the poem, the apparently facile equations are energized. To fling my arms wide in some place of the sun is at once a yearning for the African homeland, as well as for an equitable place in an America without injustice, when, that is, the white day is done. The night coming on gently is not only an evocation of a tropical twilight, but also of an America where the norm is the morality so devoutly wished for by blacks, while the night comes on gently, dark like me. And the transition from the first to the second stanza is marked by subtle changes. To fling my arms wide in some place in the sun becomes to fling my arms wide in the face of the sun. And till the white day is done becomes till the quick day is done, thus provoking an equation between the sun and white American civilization, and suggesting its death through the use of the word quick, which naturally suggests the quick and the dead. The poem is a cry of anguish, but transcends mere emotion by an artful manipulation of language. I want to refer to two other Langston Hughes' poems. They both very quietly evince the hatred of a system. First of all, there's a poem, Song for a Dark Girl. Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me, they hung my dark young lover to a crossroads tree. Way down south in Dixie, bruised body high in air, I asked the white Lord Jesus, what was the use of prayer? Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me, love is a naked shadow on a gnarled and naked tree. And here again, Langston Hughes makes good use of the art of surprise in repetition. The first stanza promises a lament for the lynched lover. Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me, they hung my dark young lover to a crossroads tree. But when we come up against the second stanza, the experience leads to doubts about America's avowed Christianity and threatens the loss of faith. Way down south in Dixie, bruised body high in air, I asked the white Lord Jesus, what was the use of prayer? And this is reinforced by the crucifixion image, bruised body high in air, which is probably mocked in the negation of the crucifixion image in the final two lines. Love is a naked shadow on a gnarled and naked tree. The lament, in fact, turns into an imprecation against America. In Merry-Go-Round, the cruelty of the system is exposed in what it does to the innocent girl, and that is what survives the grim humor of the last four lines. Where is the Jim Crow section on this merry-go-round, mister? 'Cause I want to ride. Down south where I come from, white and colored can't sit side by side. Down south on the train there's a Jim Crow car. On the bus we are put in the back, but there ain't no back to a merry-go-round. Where's the horse for a kid that's black? The ambivalence in Hughes's attitude to America that lies below the surface of these poems is also there in Mackay, the immigrant. The same subdued tone which gives so much tension to the Langston Hughes poems is to be found in Mackay's poem on a lynching, the poem entitled Lynching. Let's hope I can find that quickly. His spirit in smoke ascended to high heaven. His father, by the cruelest way of pain, had bidden him to his bosom once again. The awful sin remained still unforgiven. All night a bright and solitary star, perchance the one that ever guided him, yet gave him up at last to fate's wild whim, hung pitifully o'er the swinging char. Day dawned, and soon the mixed crowds came to view the ghastly body swaying in the sun. The women thronged to look, but never a one showed sorrow in her eyes of steely blue. And little lads, lynchers that were to be, danced round the dreadful thing in fiendish glee. Through the subdued tone, the terror mounts, and the poem achieves a note of triple horror: the deed itself, the hard inhumanity of adult onlookers and accomplices, and the damage to the innocent or the lately innocent children. In appearance a sonnet, it is a poem whose complex agony causes it to strain against the formal structure of the sonnet, and the tension and meaning of the poem must be partly sought on that level of analysis. One meaning rests on the Petrarchan division between octave and sestet, separating the victim from the perpetrators. But the two quatrains that make up the octave are pulling in slightly different directions. The first expresses one kind of anguish, for which logically there is not much justification, and must therefore be seen as impelled by a muted hate, the lynched man going to his death without making his peace with God, or could Mackay mean without ceremonial absolution. Then from this exhibition of Christian faith, the second quatrain poses the possibility of the Christian God's indifference, asking in another way the same question Langston Hughes asked in Song for a Dark Girl. Mackay has often been called the poet of hate, from Alain Locke to the present, but rarely quite without justification. An example of a hate-filled poem might be Enslaved. Oh, when I think of my long-suffering race, for weary centuries despised, oppressed, enslaved and lynched, denied a human place in the great lifeline of the Christian West, and in the black land disinherited, robbed in the ancient country of its birth, my heart grows sick with hate, becomes as lead, for this my race that has no home on earth. Then from the dark depth of my soul I cry to the avenging angel to consume the white man's world of wonders utterly. Let it be swallowed up in earth's vast womb, or upward roll as sacrificial smoke to liberate my people from its yoke. The poem suggests a breach of the divine order of things, matched by the dehumanizing effect it has on him. And no complete response to this poem can see only pure, unmitigated hate. It is a poem which, in its own way, characteristically more vigorous than Langston Hughes's, addresses themes raised in the latter's Dream Variation and Song for a Dark Girl. South Africa is a country where the whites have been entrenched for very long, long enough to call the country home, though in all conscience they have no moral claim to call home a country which they have so bestialized. Be that as it may, however, the indigenous Azanian neither contemplates nor envisages the destruction or expulsion of the white minority. The black hand held out to the Afrikaner is one of national brotherhood, in spite of the most degrading oppression, systematic and institutionalized. Accordingly, the literature that comes out of those brutalized peoples is so beautiful an exploration of their determination to preserve their humanity. It is surely that they are determined to avoid the ultimate human tragedy, which would be to abdicate one's own human stature in retaliation to unbearable violence. The South African Dennis Brutus has written a poem that, in its significance, summarizes the persistent humanity of the oppressed in that otherwise impossible situation. a common hate enriched our love and us. Escape to parasitic ease disgusts, discreet, expensive hushes stifled us, the plangent wines became acidulous. Rich foods knotted to revolting clots of guilt and anger in our queasy guts, remembering the hungry comfortless. In drafty angles of the concrete stairs, or seared by salt winds under brittle stars, we found a poignant edge to tenderness. And sharper than our strain, the passion against our land's disfigurement and tension. Hate gouged out deeper levels for our passion. A common hate enriched our love and us. One characteristic of Black South African literature is the understanding of human weakness and allowing for it. Like Alex Laguma, the South African novelist, in The Fog of the Season's End, Brutus can understand fear. And each, in his own way, celebrates courage, all the more as a result of this understanding. Like Mackay, Brutus understands how humanity is subverted by prejudice, and like Laguma, he can put that into perspective. Brutus's poetry, like so much else in Black South African literature, shows the determination to remain human, to love what is possible, to refuse to spend oneself in impotent rage. The nature of the racial experience, the social and political context, and the point in time determine the nature of protest literature. To understand this is to understand the differences between the South African situation and the North American situation up to mid-century or so. It is also to understand the unevenness of response in the Caribbean, as indeed in West Africa. One of the interesting characteristics of the phenomenon of protest literature. While French West Africa was the African home of negritude, that very prolific nation of writers, Nigeria, produced no negritude writer to speak of, and in fact produced hostility to negritude literature. One remembers Wole Soyinka's statement, which he probably regrets that he ever made. It has been so often quoted. A tiger does not proclaim his tigritude. Why should the Negro have to proclaim his negritude? I was present at the conference when Soyinka made that statement, and I can tell you that it came out just, almost by chance, and it has been hung around his neck like an albatross ever since. Of course, in West Africa, there was a spot of what one might call negritude literature in Ghana. It was not so much, well, it is negritude literature in the sense that it shares features of negritude, but it really was a literary manifestation of the political thesis of the African personality, which was popular during Nkrumah's reign. And in fact, the few writers who wrote in the vein of negritude in Ghana were in the main minor writers, and themselves moved away from that kind of writing rather quickly. And what I'm suggesting here is that the nature of the racial experience varies from country to country. It also varies in time. And of course, there are other factors that impinge on this. For instance, the South African is the Azanian, which is the best term to use if we want to talk about the indigenous peoples, is a native of South Africa. The land is his, whereas the Afro-American, like the Afro-West Indian, is one of the immigrants to the country. And from that point of view, the land, though stolen, is also partly his. But from another point of view, he is a minority anyway, and this alters the experience when you're a minority, and so on. In the Caribbean, for instance, there was more evidence of negritude in Haiti, for instance, and outside of the Francophone area in Cuba, and to a much lesser degree, a very much lesser degree, in Puerto Rico. How, therefore, does one explain this spillover from the Francophone Caribbean to the Hispanic Caribbean? The explanation for that is a much larger one. For instance, the degree of nationalism, for instance, in the Hispanic Caribbean is quite different in scale and much earlier in time than obtained in the Anglophone Caribbean. So that the whole phenomenon of political consciousness and identity is different in the Hispanic Caribbean from Anglophone Caribbean. I'm suggesting, therefore, that when one considers what I would insist is a continuous tradition of protest, black protest writing that embraces the total black experience, when one considers this, then it is necessary to bear in mind that the circumstances differ. Thus, it helps to explain the peculiar emergence of negritude in Anglophone East Africa at a time when one might have confidently pronounced that the phase of negritude had passed. I'm thinking here in particular of Okot Pibitek's Song of Lawino. And I confess that I skipped some of the examples I wanted to read because I wanted to make sure that there was time enough to read a little of Lawino for those of you who have who don't know the poem. Lawino, the Song of Lawino, is a lament by the wife Lawino, a lament which is necessitated, first of all, and it's always best to acknowledge this truth, because her husband, Ochol, has deserted her. Not territorially, he's still there in the same house with her and so on. It's the best way to desert your wife, really, to make sure that you maintain a presence, a physical presence. But he has another woman, and so that part of the energy of the poem comes from the aggrieved wife. Hell hath no fury and all that kind of thing. But it's also a poem, it's also a lament on a larger scale, because Lawino is also indicting her husband of having rejected the traditional ways of his people and having assumed the style of life of the European. So that the woman whom he has is not only another woman, but it's another woman who is also westernized, as I shall try to show from one or two excerpts. Indeed, the name Ochol itself means black man. So that when in Song of Lawino, Lawino is lamenting Ochol's abandonment of his culture, the poem becomes emblematic of the westernizing process that threatens to engulf much of Africa in the urbanization trend. What is important is that it is a lament. It's a song, as the title says. And in the song, as Lawino pours out her soul, her aggrieved soul, she not only accuses him of not observing his culture, but she manages to identify and delineate that culture in her lament without the result sounding contrived. It's really a feat of Pibitek's that he can make Lawino, in lamenting about her husband's defection, he can make her retail samples of the culture, the abandoned culture, without making the thing seem contrived. And that is very important, because both the medium of song and the delineation of cultural aspects of life mean that Okot Pibitek is not stridently proclaiming his negritude, but is allowing the poem itself to be evidence of negritude. In other words, Okot Pibitek manages to do what Wole Soyinka had been calling on the negritude writers to do for a long time. That is to say, let the fact of your negritude emerge from the nature of your art, from the subject matter, from the treatment, from the form, and so forth, rather than standing on the rooftop and proclaiming, I am African, I am a Negro, I have negritude. Soyinka's point of view is, if you're a Negro, you must have negritude. Now let me see it. See? And there's a sense in which Soyinka's work sometimes reflects this negritude without what I would dare to call, in the presence of some of my colleagues here, what I would dare to call the typical French rhetorical declamatory attitude to things. So that Song of Lawino is negritude, but it is not the strident negritude that we have come to know in the poems, in some of the poems, to be fair to them, in some of the poems of Senghor, or Léon Dama, or the Diop brothers, or Roussan Camille, and so on. It is instead a poem that is expressive of negritude, a poem that dramatizes the anguish that is the result of the westernization of Ochol, the westernization of the black man. Now, I want to read just one or two. One can, when one starts reading Song of Lawino, it's difficult to put it down. I would therefore limit myself just to a couple examples. This one, the first one I will read, is called Describes the Woman with Whom I Share My Husband. An important point to remember here is that Song of Lawino was at first written in Acholi, Pibitek's indigenous language, and then translated into English. And in addition to what I've said about the medium of song and so on, there are other aspects of traditional oral song and literature that appear in the novel. For instance, all the metaphoric references, all the furniture of the poem are in terms of the experience, the immediate experience and environment of Lawino. It is not a poem in which you will get what we might call literary metaphors, not very many of them at all. It is a poem that operates very much like a song by Lawino out in the country should operate. Its references are to the familiar environment and the immediate experience of the girl and of her listeners, which is an understandable feature, a necessary feature of traditional literature. The woman with whom I share my husband. Forgive me, brother. Do not think I'm insulting the woman with whom I share my husband. Do not think my tongue is being sharpened by jealousy. Huh. Well, we know better than that. It is the sight of Tina that provokes sympathy from my heart. The woman she shares her husband is called Clementina. Clementine. Clementina. I do not deny I'm a little jealous. It is no good lying. We all suffer from a little jealousy. It catches you unawares like the ghosts that bring fevers. It surprises people like earth tremors. But when you see the beautiful woman with whom I share my husband, you feel a little pity for her. Her breasts are completely shriveled up. They are all folded dry skins. They have made nests of cotton wool, and she folds the bits of cowhide in the nests and calls them breasts. Oh, my clansmen, how aged modern women pretend to be young girls. They mold the tips of the cotton nests so that they're sharp, and with these they prick the chests of their men, and the men believe they're holding the waists of young girls that have just shut up. The modern type sleep with their nests tied firmly on their chests. How many kids has this woman sucked? The empty bags on her chest are completely flattened, dried. Perhaps she has aborted many. Perhaps she has thrown her twins in the pit latrine. Is it the vengeance ghosts of the many smashed eggs that have captured her head? How young is this age mate of my mother? You get the real venom of an aggrieved wife there, you know. The woman with whom I share my husband walks as if her shadow has been captured. You can never hear her footsteps. She looks as if she has been ill for a long time. Actually, she is starving. She does not eat. She says she fears getting fat, that the doctor has prevented her from eating. She says a beautiful woman must be slim like a white woman. And when she walks, you hear her bones rattling. Her waist resembles that of the hornet. The beautiful one is dead dry like a stump. She is meatless like a shell on a dry river bed. And in that excerpt, the important thing is that the values against which Lawino is measuring Clementina are values, norms within the traditional life. When she says her waist is like a hornet, you know, almost every young lady in this would jump up and say, what's wrong with that? But of course, many Africans, not all by any means, but many Africans, many African communities like to see their women plump and healthy and so on. So it's these values that are there all the time, silently providing the means of measuring Clementina. Well, let me just read one more. And this one is on the mystery of creation. She has been exposed to things like Sunday school and so forth. Right? We recited the faith of the messengers like the yellow birds in the La Janawara grass. The teacher shouted as if half mad, and we shouted back. I accept the hunchback, the padre who is very strong, molder of skyland and earth. You see, part of the technique, of course, is to put this in the conceptualization of Lawino. My mother was a well-known potter. She molded large pots, vegetable pots, and beautiful long-necked jars. She made water pots and smoking pipes and vegetable dishes, and large earthen vessels for bath. She dug the clay from the mouth of the Oitino River. The place was well known among potters. I heard about it when I was a small girl, and when my breasts emerged, I went with my mother and helped her carrying the clay. The hunchback where did he dig the clay for molding things? Where is the pot he dug the clay for molding Skyland, and the clay for molding earth? From the mouth of which river? When my mother has brought the clay from the river, she leaves it to season overnight. The next day she beats it with a wooden hammer, and then she molds the pots and dishes, and none of her works crack when fired. When Skyland was not yet there, and earth was not yet molded, nor the stars nor the moon, when there was nothing, where did the hunchback live? Where did the hunchback dig the clay for molding things, the clay for molding Skyland, the clay for molding earth, the clay for molding moon, the clay for molding the stars? Where is the spot where it was dug? On the mouth of which river? And when the hunchback was digging the clay, where did he stand? And when he brought home the clay for molding things, where did he put the clay to season overnight? And when he was beating it with a wooden hammer, on which rock did the hunchback put the clay? And thus she expresses her mystification about their creation. Now, it is because black protest literature is really one continuum that we can understand why it takes the form that it does in East Africa. The negritude writers themselves had been not a little influenced by people like Alain Locke, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and so on, because the negritude itself began in Paris, and Sango and Césaire and one or two others, Tyrolien, later on, Dama, met the Harlem Renaissance writers who were at that time quartered in Paris, met also the Haitian writers who were quartered in Paris, and were infected to an enormous degree by the revelations of a literature they had known very little about, which came at a time when they themselves were beginning to react against the scholarly discovery of African art and African culture and so on. And suddenly, therefore, they began to develop this identity of themselves. And the best poems in which to see this revulsion from the assimilated black Frenchman, the best poems in which to see this revulsion in the raw would be, in my view, the poems of Léon Dama. He's the poet who really expresses that revulsion most strongly. The South African writers, in turn, had themselves been exposed to the Harlem Renaissance and the negritudinists. The point I am making is, once writers are conscious of this tradition of protest literature, they are not likely to go through the same phases and the same motions which have already been played out in the literature. They are themselves re-evaluating the literature of protest and trying to extract from it those aspects which help them to see their own situation better. I think, in fact, it is in the light of this kind of continuity that one can understand better even certain more recent expressions of protest in the United States itself. Ellison's The Invisible Man is sometimes easily explained away as a non-racial novel, a novel that abjures race protest and is simply a universal, kind of experience. In point of fact, if one understands that as time goes on and as the circumstances change, the stance of the protest writer also changes with it. One can better see how The Invisible Man is first of all race protest, and then after that universal work. And which is the right order, the point on which I wish to close in a minute. Similarly, that sense of continuity and of development would explain another protest work, say like Sam Greenlee's The Spook Who Sat by the Door. The point is that literature, as I think George Eliot once said of art, all art, she said, begins by being provincial. And in a very rare sense, this is true. She might have been trying to defend things like Middlemarch or Adam Bede or Silas Marner. But in that sense, it is also true. But there is another sense in which it is even truer, that the artist, and particularly the writer, relates to the experience which is closest to him, which is deepest in his bones. That need not be, of course, his village. In some cases, it takes a different form. It might even be more distant. But certainly, there is no experience that can be deeper in the bones of a black man in North America, in particular in South Africa, and also in the colonized parts of the African diaspora. There is no experience that can be deeper in his bones than the experience of prejudice in one form or another. More extreme, obviously, in South Africa than anywhere else. More extreme in North America than in the Caribbean. But the subtle forms of it are fully appreciated in places where it is not as extreme as elsewhere. But in dealing with that experience of oppression, the black man is reacting as a human being. And therefore, the nature of his response must of necessity speak to all human beings, so that there's that level on which the work becomes universal. The Invisible Man can become universal while still remaining a novel about black experience. And indeed, any of these poems, if they're good, that qualification must always be made. If they're good poems, they also, while speaking about the most intense personal experience, is in fact speaking about you and me. Is speaking about the human reaction to suffering anywhere. And so, when the writer, because first of all I'm speaking about the experience of the man as a man, when the writer in turn comes to treat of this experience, and at the same time wants to be a voice of protest on behalf of his people, but also a writer, and therefore necessarily having to respect certain canons of the art, it becomes a very interesting situation for the student of literature. How can the black writer, and by extension any writer in a similar position, be at once the voice of propaganda, so to speak, for his people? How can he respond to the urge and need for commitment, and at the same time transmute that into art? I submit that the process whereby those who succeed do it become in itself a matter of interest for students of literature, beyond the aesthetic aspect of the matter. There is the further exploration which it provides of the human spirit struggling to express itself in circumstances that seem to defy that expression. My final point is that while that in itself is as worthy as any other kind of literature for study, perhaps the most important point is that that experience of human suffering and the human resilience that meets it should be brought at all levels of our educational curricula before our students, so that they, generation after generation, come to understand what kind of bestialities man is capable of, but how in turn man is equally capable of rising above these. How the experience of an oppressed people can vindicate the human race. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Drayton. This was delightful and very meaningful. Dolores Hawkins has asked me to tell you that there will be a reception at the Black Cultural Center right after the lecture, so I think we will not take time now for questions, but hope that you can go to the Black Cultural Center that is on Welch Avenue, around the 500 block, and so on. So thank you very much for coming out on this snowy evening. Thank you again.